The young and the restless spoilers shocked Claire was the one left reeling in the aftermath, her heart pulverized by the cruel revelation that Kyle had been intimate with Audra. She paced the length of her loft apartment late into the night, each footstep echoing against bare walls like the drumbeat of her own mounting panic. She stumbled upon the photos Audra had so meticulously staged. Kyle rendered unconscious by a drugged glass of wine, his clothes discarded beside the bed, vulnerable and unknowing, while Audra's triumphant grin, captured in those images, burned on the page like acid. Claire pressed trembling fingers to her temples, as if physical pressure might sever the vision from her mind, but the pictures refused to fade. Every detail, the tangled sheets, the sheen of sweat on Kyle's forehead, the calculated angle Audra had chosen to immortalize her victory, etched itself into Claire's consciousness, refusing to be denied. Unwilling to face the cold light of morning, Claire sought oblivion in the bottom of a wine bottle. She poured measures far beyond her usual restraint, the crimson liquid sliding down her throat with a harsh burn that seemed fitting for her battered soul. Tears streamed unchecked as guilt and betrayal warred within her, leaving her no escape but to drink until her vision blurred. In that haze, every memory of gentle mornings with Kyle, of shared laughter and whispered promises, was replaced by Audra's malevolent laughter and the clinching horror of Kyle's apparent complicity. Claire stroked the ring Kyle had given her, its metal weight a reminder of vows she believed were sacred. Now it felt like a shackle. She begged the night sky for answers, for some sliver of hope that Audra's story was a lie, and yet Audra's photos stared back, accusatory and unrelenting. In her drunken despair, Claire rose to fetch another glass, her foot catching the edge of a rug. She pitched forward, arms flailing, and the room spun in a vertigo of motion. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the deafening crash as she struck the edge of the coffee table, pain blooming in her temple like a wrathful sun. When she came to, the world was a palette of flashing lights and hushed voices. A paramedic leaned over her, voice muffled through a haze of analgesics already coursing through her veins. She tried to speak but found her tongue heavy and her thoughts scattered. Through blurred vision she saw a uniformed officer take notes, his expression professional but his eyes betraying a flicker of concern. Sirens wailed in the distance, mingling with the drone of anxious questions and the soft sobbing of her mother. Victoria rushed into the hospital hallway as soon as she received the call, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished tile floor. She had never raced through corridors with such raw fear clawing at her chest. Upon seeing Claire's motionless form on the stretcher, blanketed in a crisp white sheet, Victoria collapsed against the gurney's rail, tears spilling in torrents. "My baby," she choked, fingers trembling as she brushed Claire's hair from her forehead. "Please wake up. Please be all right." Nurses hovered nearby, offering sterile reassurances that felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. Victoria pressed closer, her ear against Claire's damp cheek to catch the faintest whisper of breath. Around them, a hospital seemed to hold its breath, as though time itself waited for the verdict of life or unconsciousness. Meanwhile, Audra reveled in her triumph from afar, unconcerned with Claire's suffering. She fielded congratulatory messages from her attorney, each ping of her phone a note in her triumphant symphony. Whispers of sympathy had swelled around her claim of pregnancy, even as rumors of Claire's accident began to surface in the tabloids. Audra's lips curved into a knowing smile, every distraction served her cause, and the spectacle of Claire's downfall only tightened her grip on the narrative. In the cold logic of her ambition, Claire's crash was just another scene in the grand drama. A martyrdom of innocence that would make Audra's victory all the more unquestionable. And yet, in the depths of her scheming mind, a flicker of unease lingered. Would public outrage over Claire's injury, portrayed as the tragic consequence of a love-struck girl's folly, shift sympathy back toward the Abbott camp? Kyle, oblivious at first to the full extent of Claire's agony, received the news of her accident like a physical blow. He had been holed up in a rented office, poring over legal briefs and the flimsy evidence Audra had assembled against him. When Nate burst through the door, panic in his eyes, Kyle felt all the blood drain from his face. Claire, he breathed, voice raw. What happened? Nate relayed the sequence of events, the wine, the photos, the crash, and Kyle's world fractured into jagged splinters. He dropped to his knees, pressing hands to his face as sobs racked his chest. Guilt and fear coalesced into a single emotion, that he had lost her forever. Thoughts tumbled through his mind. What if she blamed him for her pain? What if Audra's lies had become her truth? What if, after all he had endured, the woman he loved would never forgive him? In the sterile glow of the hospital room, Claire lay unconscious, her pale face peaceful for the first time since the scandal erupted. On the bedside table stood a solitary photograph. A cherished snapshot of her and Kyle on a sunlit beach, arms entwined, smiles unguarded and free. Victoria hovered nearby, brushing Claire's hair back as though coaxing her daughter back from the brink. The soft beeping of the 4-line counted the seconds of Claire's unconscious breath, a fragile reminder of the life at stake. Outside her door, nurses and detectives exchanged furtive glances. Was this an accident born of alcohol and despair, or a darker reflection of the same betrayal that had ensnared Kyle? The hallways whispered with speculation, each footstep carrying the weight of unanswered questions. In the abyss of her coma, Claire's mind drifted through a labyrinth of memories, of innocence and betrayal, of the intoxicating rush of first love, and of the shattering pain when that love turned to accusation. She saw Kyle's gentle smile, heard his laughter like a distant echo, and felt the warmth of his hands. She saw Audra's triumphant smirk and tasted the bitter tang of injustice. And in that twilight realm between waking and dreaming, Claire vowed that if she emerged from this darkness, she would no longer be the naive girl who sipped trust like wine. She would find the strength to confront the lies, to reclaim her voice, and to stand against Audra's machinations with the clarity of one who had seen the abyss, and refused to remain in its depths. When at last Claire's eyelids fluttered open, the room seemed to exhale in relief. Victoria wept anew, squeezing her daughter's hand as Claire's gaze found her own. In that moment of fragile reunion, all the threads of deceit and heartbreak converged. Claire's pain, Kyle's guilt, Audra's ambition, and Victoria's fierce protectiveness. The stage was set for the next act in this relentless drama, one in which love, once weaponized, must now be wielded as the force capable of cutting through every lie. And as Claire's strength returned, so too did her resolve. She would no longer be a pawn in Audra's game, nor a victim of her own inexperience. She would emerge from this trial not as the heartbroken ingenue, but as a woman forged in fire. Ready to expose the trap that had nearly destroyed her and to reclaim the life that had been stolen by a single, malicious photograph. In the merciless glare of the emergency room's fluorescent lights, Claire lay motionless beneath a tangle of crisp white sheets, her body broken but her spirit as yet unbowed. The paramedics who had raced her through the rain-slicked streets of Genoa City only hours before had fought to stabilize her injuries. Multiple fractures, a severe concussion, and a host of lacerations that betrayed the force of her fall. Outside, the storm that had driven her from her loft apartment into that ill-fated plunge was abating, yet its echoes still reverberated through the hospital corridors in the form of anxious footsteps and hushed whispers. In the waiting area, the Newman family had gathered as one trembling, grief-stricken unit. At the center of their circle stood Victoria, her shoulders quaking as tears coursed down her cheeks, eyes fixed on the double doors through which her daughter had disappeared. Beside her, Cole wrapped a protective arm around his mother's trembling frame, pressing his forehead against hers as though to shield them both from the agonizing possibility that Claire might slip beyond their reach. Kate whispered fervent prayers from the edge of a plastic chair, while Christine, ever the warrior, paced the linoleum floor, her lips moving in silent invocations of hope. Victor Newman, patriarch of the family whose will had hitherto seemed unbreakable, stood apart from the others, his expression inscrutable yet heavy with remorse. His bespoke suit, soaked through from the torrents that had driven him to the hospital, clung to him like a second skin, each droplet of rain a stark reminder of the part he had played in the evening's tragic events. He replayed the day's scheme in his mind, how he had entrusted Audra with the precise details necessary to ensnare Kyle, how he had monitored her progress with tactical detachment, and how he had cheered, privately, intoxicatingly, when her accusations had taken hold of the public's imagination. Never had he imagined that Audra's ruthless ambition would extend so far as to orchestrate a scenario leading to Claire's brutal fall. The sight of his daughter battered and unconscious in the oar, her life suspended on a fragile thread, pierced him more deeply than any corporate defeat ever could. He pressed his hands to his temples, willing himself to summon the strength to face his family, even as guilt opened an unhealed wound within his chest. In that charged silence, the weight of what had transpired descended upon Victor like an avalanche. For decades, he had wielded power with Glock-like precision, bending boardrooms, marriages, and fortunes to his will. Yet no contract, no hostile takeover, no market conquest had prepared him for the raw devastation of witnessing Claire's body broken by a plan he had set in motion. He wondered, with a sickening lurch, whether his brand of justice, meticulous, unwavering, coldly strategic, was at odds with the very humanity he had long believed he could subordinate. If the truth of his orchestration were ever unveiled, he realized, the consequences would be cataclysmic. Genoa City's elite, who had once bowed before him, would recoil at the revelation that he had sacrificed an innocent life's safety for the sake of vengeance against the abbots. His empire, built on decades of relentless ambition, could crumble beneath the tidal wave of public outrage. Even within the sanctum of his own bloodline, he risked alienation. Victoria, whose admiration for him had always bordered on devotion, might feel herself complicit in his sins. Cole, his grandson, might come to regard him with revulsion, and Kate, whose own past had been marked by hardship at the Newman hands, might seize upon this scandal as the final proof of his moral bankruptcy. While these dark thoughts consumed Victor, the hospital staff worked furiously to keep Claire alive. In the operating theater, surgeons moved with the calm efficiency that came from years of confronting life's fragility on a daily basis. They reset broken bones, drained hematomas from her brain, and stitched the jagged edges of her wounds. Beyond their sterile masks, their eyes reflected a determined compassion, as though they understood that their patient was more than statistics in a chart. She was a young woman whose dreams and loves had been shredded by forces far outside her control. In the sterile waiting room, Victor caught snippets of their hushed exchanges. "She's stable for now, we'll keep her sedated." Complications could arise. Each word hammered home the precariousness of Claire's condition, driving Victor deeper into the abyss of remorse. Elsewhere in the hospital, Nate Hastings paced the length of the hall, guilt and anguish waging war within him. He had been at Kyle's side earlier, poring over legal documents and preparing for the turmoil of the upcoming hearing when the news of Claire's accident had shattered their world. He had left Kyle, who was battling Audra's slanderous claims in court, under the watchful eye of trusted allies, only to be confronted here by the horror of Claire's fall. Now, Nate's normally steady gait was disrupted by the rush of emotions he refused to allow himself when serving as Claire's protector and Kyle's confidant. He replayed the evening in his mind. The frantic phone call from Claire, the anguished plea for him to believe in Kyle's innocence, and the chilling realization that Claire's grief had driven her to a reckless spiral of alcohol-fueled despair. He cursed himself for not intervening sooner, for not sensing the depth of Claire's vulnerability before the trap closed entirely. Meanwhile, Kyle Abbott remained oblivious to the physical wreckage his beloved lay in, trapped instead in his own legal purgatory. He was holed up in a downtown attorney's office, surrounded by stacks of files and newspapers plastered with Audra's tear-stained photos. When Nate burst in with the news of Claire's accident, Kyle's world fractured. His knees buckled as he dropped to the floor, head bowed in an agony of guilt. He had ignored Claire's warnings, had scoffed at her intuition that Audra's claims were too neatly contrived. Now, each discarded cautionary text, each unheeded plea, loomed before him like a ghost whispering accusations of negligence and cowardice. He pressed his palms into his eyes, the image of Claire's battered body flickering behind his eyelids until he thought he might go mad from the weight of his responsibility. As night surrendered to dawn, Victor emerged from the operating room's antechamber, his face drawn, his posture slumped. The surgeon delivered the news. Claire was out of immediate danger, but the road to recovery would be long and fraught with uncertainty. There was the risk of permanent nerve damage in her legs, the possibility of lasting cognitive impairment from the concussion, and the emotional trauma that would shadow her for years to come. Upon hearing this, Victoria wept anew, clutching her father's arm as though seeking to anchor herself to someone who could, or at least should, have the answers. Victor could offer none. His own soul was as broken as Claire's body. He realized in that moment that no amount of power could shield him from the guilt that now weighed upon him like a millstone. The bedrock foundations of his identity, his capacity to protect, to command, to prevail, had cracked beneath the knowledge that he had imperiled the life of an innocent girl for the sake of a vendetta. In the days that followed, the scandal surrounding Audra's accusations and Claire's accident consumed Genoa City's collective attention. Headlines shifted from Kyle's alleged crime to the grim details of Claire's injuries, and murmurs about Victor's possible involvement began to surface in the press. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the mastermind behind the plot was none other than Victor Newman himself, that he had bankrolled Audra's machinations from the start. Others insisted this was yet another tabloid fantasy, a desperate attempt to tarnish Newman Enterprises. But the question hung over every cocktail party and water cooler conversation: what would happen if Victor's role was exposed? Advocates for justice argued that the legal system must hold him accountable, that wealth and influence should not grant immunity from endangering a civilian's life. On the other hand, supporters warned that such a revelation could plunge Genoa City into chaos, destabilizing its economic and social order. Within the sterile walls of her hospital room, Claire lay in a drug-induced haze, her body failing to respond to the trauma it had endured. Yet even in that vulnerable state, her mind flickered with the embers of defiance. She vowed that, if she survived this ordeal, she would unmask every layer of deception that had cost her body so grievously. She would find the courage to stand before a jury and declare that Audra's pictures were a lie, that Kyle had been drugged without knowledge or consent, and that the real architect of her near-fatal fall was someone far more powerful. And when she emerged from her convalescence, she would confront Victor with a single question: "Forgive me if you can, but do you truly believe that vengeance is worth the price of an innocent life?" In time, whether the public would discover the full extent of Victor's scheme or forever wonder at the shadows played out behind closed doors remained uncertain. What was certain, however, was that the fragile bonds of family, love, and justice in Genoa City had been irrevocably tested. And as Claire fought to reclaim her strength, and Kyle to restore his reputation, the city itself braced for the reckoning that loomed on the horizon, a reckoning that would expose the truth in all its harsh clarity, and determine whether, in the end, power could ever atone for the devastation it had wrought.